The ethics of autobiographical writing in palliative care. This has been carried out in partial fulfilment of PhD research and is supported by a Trobe University research scholarship funded in part by Eastern Palliative Care. My supervisors are Dr. Bruce Rumbold, Dr. David Azul, and Dr. Fiona Gardner, and previously Dr. Susan Finesse. When receiving palliative care, Teresa's father was offered the assistance of a volunteer to help him write his autobiography, and he began enthusiastically. He thought it was an ideal vehicle to write about his experience of living with an uncommon health condition. And his daughter later wrote that it took his mind off his health to have a nice visitor. But in the end, he was unsatisfied with the biography, saying that the volunteer didn't take proper notes. This is just one story that highlights some of the issues that may be encountered when facilitating life storytelling. Eastern Palliative Care, or EPC, serves a large area of the eastern suburbs of Melbourne and offers the biography program to all their patients. Patients tell their life story to a volunteer who records them, types up a transcript, and works with the patient to edit the verbal storytelling into a written legacy document. The circular process of storytelling and editing continues until the patient is satisfied or, unfortunately, until they have died, up to about 8 sessions. The volunteer services team oversees the program and recruit and train a group of highly engaged volunteers. And I've been researching the biography program since 2020, focusing on its development, functioning, and the experience of the 4 main groups: the patients who write their biography, the volunteer biographers, the patient carers, and EPC staff. And I've surveyed and interviewed people from each group. Overall, the program is very well received and everyone speaks very highly of it. It is EPC's most popular volunteer program. However, I started with this more difficult story, as this is an exploration of the less common stories and how EPC navigates practical, legal, or family-based issues that may occur. In the literature on volunteer-facilitated biography programs, it is acknowledged that ongoing support to manage the challenges of volunteering is needed, but there is minimal discussion about how this might be facilitated. There are also only brief mentions of the practical issues that may occur, such as the tension between storytelling and what is printed, family dynamics, and ethical or legal issues. EPC's biography program has been operating since 2006. They now have about 100 volunteer biographers and produce up to about 100 biographies each year. They provide their volunteers with substantial training, support, policies and procedures, communication expectations, and more to ensure a smooth process. And they have gained a lot of experience, and their program development demonstrates their ability to adapt. But it is some of these more problematic stories that have shaped their development. For example, when one patient wanted to write a biography specifically for his kids that outlined everything that was wrong with his ex-wife, their mother, that was influential in tailoring EPC's approach. The volunteer services staff who manage the biography program embed their management approach firstly within patient-focused holistic palliative care. Secondly, that there can be meaning found and growth experienced in all stages of life. And finally, the importance of relationship and so communication. While each aspect is founded on their duty of care for the patient, they each expand to encompass everyone involved: volunteers, staff, and family. Everything is seen through the lens of relationship, and this is modelled by the staff who develop relationships with their volunteers, building trust and facilitating ongoing communication. The volunteers are trained in communication and a variety of storytelling facilitation approaches, amongst other things, and are viewed as integral members of the overall care team by EPC, receiving relevant information about patients and contributing to patient notes where appropriate. When writing a life story, there are always questions of what to include, and patients may choose to censor stories themselves. Florence said she was very deliberate in what she included out of respect for her family, saying that her mother had taught her only to say something if it was true, kind, and necessary. Life storytelling may allow you to privately get things off your chest with the volunteer, but it doesn't mean that it has to be included in the final product. This can be contrasted by the son who said Dad never held back. His father's biography included very candid opinions about people, not to mention stories that, while true, others said shouldn't be talked about, such as a secret sister. She had been hidden away as she had been born with a disability, and the father, her brother, only discovered this later on. One volunteer told me about a patient who described teachers from their school years as doing something a bit naughty. He later discussed this with the patient, who thought it was best to take it out. But this raises an interesting ethical question. What if, in similar situations, storytelling reveals identifiable details of a person and is potentially libelous? Or if this type of vague storytelling continues a practice of shielding abuse? I don't think this was the issue here, but if it did occur, it may create an ethical question for the volunteer who is there simply to assist in writing a life story. If the patient genuinely wishes to expose wrongdoing or illegal activities, there are far better avenues to be directed to than through a volunteer-facilitated not-for-profit program that potentially leaves the patient, volunteer, and organisation legally exposed. But it's also just as likely that this wasn't so much truth-telling as the drama of storytelling. This is not common though, and for the most part, the patient easily decides what is included in the final biography, as it is an opportunity to tell their story the way they want to tell it. Volunteers may feel prompted to check in with the patient if they think there are gaps in the story, or a particular focus on one child but not another, for example, or if it seems that something may be hurtful to someone if they were to read it. But if there is no reason to suspect there are gaps or anything hurtful, there is little that can be done. Patients prompted by the volunteers are often happy to review and take out questionable comments, balancing truth-telling, reminiscence, and life reflection with maintaining a sense of audience and legacy. Some don't censor themselves, saying, "I'll tell you this, you can put it in because I'll be gone." Others may tell the volunteer stories of first marriages, for example, that no one in their family knows about, and the volunteer is instructed not to include it. There was one story a volunteer told me I did find a bit surprising. It was of a patient who had told them of an affair many years earlier, an off-the-record story. It was the volunteer who was conflicted by the story's absence, saying that he thought an authentic telling of someone's life story should include it, for, as he said to the patient, she was an important part of your life for a long time. The volunteer discussed this further with the staff, but he never clarified if the story was included. I assume that it wasn't due to the relational approach and their sense of caution, but either way, it would have been discussed further with the patient. All the volunteers I spoke to said they would and have been, happily raising any questions they have with the staff. This raises the question of intent for the patient in writing. Is it meant to be a revelation of that individual? I would argue that for the most part, they just intend this to be their story told the way they want to tell it, even if this is balanced with some personal revelation during the storytelling. While the volunteers provide technical support, they are also a non-judgmental, listening witness to the patient's life. Volunteers identify privacy and confidentiality as key benefits to having a previously unknown volunteer facilitate this process rather than friends or family. While one nurse said it was often helpful to have family present when they initially recommend the program, as families often encourage the patient to participate, volunteers can't be sure of the broader family dynamics. On occasions, such as in the earlier short story of an estranged man wanting to write about his ex-wife, lawyers have had to be consulted due to EPC's desire to minimise harm, particularly for children. And they now have policies such as if the information is in the public court records, it can be included, but if not, taking out such information from the final printing is recommended. They take their responsibility for mandatory reporting very seriously, and everyone regularly errs on the side of caution. For some patients, accuracy is important. Steve saw this process as an extension of his passion for genealogy, planning to share his final biography on one of the websites. He had done extensive family research and had found it difficult to find some details, saying he now thought that everything should be included, including the illegitimate children, to use his example. But event accuracy wasn't his only concern. He also included some thoughts about his complicated relationships with his father, something he said he appreciated talking about, but he was always conscious others might read it. Ultimately, his weighing of truth and audience was summed up by him saying, if they don't like what I write, well, that's too bad, it's too late. I found patients to be very conscious of the legacy aspect. If the process became one of enjoyable self-reflection, that was often an unexpected benefit rather than the expectation. One patient commented that initially it was like a job she did for her kids. That she enjoyed it came as a surprise. The softening or editing of words is not uncommon. Proofreading is required for all documents, not for accuracy, but to ensure a well-produced document. One volunteer said she occasionally leaves out words or makes subtle changes. She later checks this with the patients, confirming that her editing oversight is often appreciated. When edits are made by the volunteer and confirmed with the patient may also edit or make corrections to the draft. And given that not everyone can use track changes in words or may be using a paper copy to make edits, if these edits were not then transferred into the final biography by the volunteer, their absence was noted to me, sometimes repeatedly, if gently, by patients or carers, even if they otherwise greatly appreciated the program, highlighting just how much care needs to be taken in the telling of someone else's story and the responsibility the volunteer has. Patients often said they didn't know what to expect from this process, which isn't surprising. It's not a common service. And our understanding of an autobiography or biography comes from the bookshop. But even unconscious expectations do appear to affect the process. And some issues may be due to mismatched expectations of voice. Does the patient or family expect the document to sound like the person telling the stories? Volunteers do deliberately try to maintain the voice of the patient, but some may expect a more polished finish. I assume this was the expectation of Diane's late husband. He appreciated the experience, but said to her that he didn't think the volunteer was a very good report writer, as he had to do a lot of corrections. And I find the use of this phrase interesting, and I think it spoke to his expectations. For others, the keeping of voice is appreciated. The man with the honest father that said that when the family read his biography, they heard his voice saying, that's exactly him, that's the way he talks. He recognised that for those who didn't know his father, it would probably read as a bit scattered, but for the family, the tone was appreciated. I was also told the story of a daughter reading a draft of their mother's biography without permission, disliking it, and asking their mother to stop. In this instance, the mother continued saying, I'm not going to stop doing it because I love doing it. Now, the patients may not respond like this. Other avenues for family discord may come not by what is written, but by what is left out. One carer said their husband mainly focused on his rise from humble beginnings to a successful career. Consequently, he didn't include much about his family, and the absence was noted by his children, who seemed a little cheesed off that he didn't mention them very, very much. This actually isn't entirely uncommon. Some volunteers said that they prompt patients to speak more about areas they haven't covered, such as family. Some describe themselves as not being very pushy. Others are more forthright in their approach, saying they try to jolly the patients on. You need to tell me all the soppy stuff as well. However, this male volunteer did say that he only really felt comfortable doing this with men, even though the lack of said soppy stuff isn't only absent in male biographies. The volunteer's facilitation approach may depend on many things: the personality of the volunteer and the patient, their relationship, how forthcoming the patient is, and the volunteer's experience, just to mention a few. There is a lot for the volunteer to navigate, and sometimes they may misread situations. One of the survey respondents wrote that while they admired the enthusiasm of the volunteer, they made assumptions. This included the volunteer asking rather direct questions about our perceptions of our mother, which was not appreciated and ended up being incredibly awkward and difficult. The volunteer didn't seem to realise their potential blunder at the time, instead thinking the idea of involving family was terrific, which it may be for some. The survey participants suggested that any family inclusion of the biography be negotiated through an appropriately skilled person, not a volunteer, as this is expecting too much of them. Except this is the role of the volunteer, with the support of the staff and their training, of course, highlighting how important recruitment, training, and ongoing assistance is. But as with all the other stories, this is the exception, not the rule. It was far more common for families and patients to speak highly of the volunteers and vice versa. Coming back to my original story of Teresa and her father, despite the difficulties and his dissatisfaction with the final process, she saw it as an overall beneficial experience, saying it kept him engaged and interested. Even if you're annoyed, you're sort of thinking about things, aren't you? You're engaged in things. But she also said another family member was hurt by some of what was written in a draft, and even though it was eventually taken out from the final printing, they still believed the final product should be burnt as it was still tainted for them. For the man who hadn't written about his children, he used the biography as an opportunity to share some of his career experiences, including some co-workers' actions that were potentially illegal. Due to lawyers' advice, it wasn't included in the final EPC printing. His wife said that his assistant now had a copy of the final biography and was going through it to include additional information. And this points to a key strategy EPC employs. Along with printing 2 copies of the final product, EPC also provides a digital version on USB. This means the patient could make edits, add more stories or photos, and that more copies can be printed. Can also be edited further, and if the family ends up in possession of the biography, this might be a cathartic process for some, although this may also raise ethical questions within the family unit, but this is far beyond the scope of EPC to monitor or be responsible for. Over time, EPC has developed many policies and procedures that help streamline the process, some of which I have discussed, but there are many more to both protect and assist the volunteer and the patient. The volunteer's role blurs between technical assistant, trusted confidant, and ghostwriter. Patients are informed of the process of the biography program at the start and sign a consent form. The volunteers are trained and receive ongoing assistance, and the success of the program is balanced on the often brief but also potentially significant relationship between patient and volunteer, and on the volunteer's ability to communicate not only with the patient but with staff when necessary. The volunteer staff take their leadership, training and managing very seriously, deliberately constructing a relationship-based culture, and they work hard to develop relationships with the volunteers and in turn trust the volunteers to act with wisdom and discernment based on their training and the life experience they so often bring to the role. And it is only through relationship and communication that the volunteer can learn how best to guide and support each patient in the writing of their life story that can be left as a legacy. Thank you.